Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ENS Africa's webinar on the Cybercrimes Bill. A very warm welcome to all of you today. By way of introduction, my name is Ridwan Boda. I'm head of the Technology, Media and Telecommunications Law Practice at ENS Africa. With me today are my colleagues Raki Dulab and Jessica Steele, who will also be talking you through today's presentation. Today's intended to be more of an introduction to the Cybercrimes Bill, so it's by no means the masterclass on it. Obviously, through the course of today's session, you will have a lot of questions on the bill. And the bill itself, the way it's worded, does raise a lot of issues, a lot of questions, and there are some gray areas as well. Hopefully, through the course of today's session, you'll get a better feel for what the bill entails, what the government is trying to do when it comes to the regulation of cybercrimes, but also how cybercrimes legislation ties in with other pieces of legislation, such as POPI and other regulatory interventions, such as perhaps SARB directives and the like. In the course of today's discussion, my colleague Raki Dulab will start with where are we with the bill. But before we even get there, we will start with cybercrimes defined. So what is a cybercrime? Some really interesting facts and figures around cybercrime. Then the status of the bill, because I think there's still a lot of confusion out there, including in the media, as to what is the status of the bill. And then Jessica will go through the overview of the bill. We'll talk you through the various provisions within the bill. And then finally, I'll conclude with tying it all together as to what your next step should be as a company. What should you be thinking about when it comes to practically applying the bill or the impact of the bill on your organization? And what interventions should you be putting in place or thinking about putting in place in the months and years to come? Obviously, with POPI implementation coming very shortly, the end of June is around the corner. The Cybercrimes Bill does come at a very opportune time for organizations to align both their privacy landscape as well as the cybersecurity landscape, because the two cannot be seen in isolation. Just some housekeeping rules. We unfortunately will not have time to answer questions directly through to you, but we do encourage you to pop any questions you may have into the chat box. When doing so, please do leave your name and organization name. We will endeavor to get back to you individually via email or through personal contact based on your questions. And as usual, the normal housekeeping rules apply. Please do mute your microphones. And I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Over to Raki.
Thanks, Ridwan. Welcome, everyone. It's good. I would like to say see you, but unfortunately not. But thank you for joining us. I know everyone's days are very busy, so it's great to have you with us here today. So I think, top of mind when you think about the Cybercrimes Bill is one of the first questions you would ask is what constitutes a cybercrime? That is where you would ordinarily start with any piece of law. And funny enough, the bill actually doesn't provide a definition for cybercrime. Instead, it creates a number of offenses. So it goes into quite a bit of detail, and we'll get to that in a few slides on about what constitutes an offense and essentially what constitutes a cybercrime. So when you look at those sections holistically, you'll come to see what a cybercrime means in terms of the law. But we do have this National Cybersecurity Policy Framework that was published in 2012. And in there, they tried to give cybercrime some sort of definition. And they said that a cybercrime means an illegal act, the commission of which involves the use of technology, use of information and communication technologies. I mean, if that was a waste of a definition, I don't know what else could be that. I think that's a perfect example of it. It's saying nothing. All it's saying is that a cybercrime is some sort of illegal action. And the Cybercrimes Bill makes the actions illegal. So in one way, that is one of the best things about the Cybercrimes Bill is it actually now gives effect and codifies those actions that we know to be criminal, and it legally now makes it criminal. So there's a little bit of gray area, but we do generally, if you live in the digital world, you're very aware of all of the different types of cybercrimes that, people are, falling victim to. They tend to be anything from, identity profile, and they create accounts in your name. And in the digital world, that's quite rife. Other types of cybercrimes are ransomware attacks. Those are very popular, especially in the last few years. That's when somebody, gets into your systems or your software, in your technology, in your infrastructure, and they basically lock you out of it. They shut down your access to your own infrastructure, to your own systems, and then you'll get a really nice pop-up saying, pay us so many Bitcoin because that's the digital currency of criminals, and we will, allow you access back into your software. I mean, I can tell you a whole presentation on how to deal with those sorts of situations, but essentially that's a form of cybercrime. Some of the others might be phishing attacks. So, the very common emails where you've won a prize and click here, and the minute you click there, they want your PIN and your email address so that they can access all of your accounts. And you would think that people would know that, they haven't won a competition because they haven't entered the competition, or that they didn't sign up to receive those emails, and they wouldn't click on those, but you'd be surprised. The fact that these attacks are still happening, and it means people are clicking on them. So those, I think, in a nutshell, are some of the various cyber crimes that we do find these days. So I think when we can look at a few interesting facts and stats about cybercrime, I think, being in South Africa, people are under the misconception that, we may not have much cybercrime or very little cybercrime. And I think you'd be quite surprised to learn that that is not the case at all. So I think in general, in 2020, it was documented that 80% of organizations saw a rise in cyber attacks. There's an attempted cyber attack every 28 seconds. That's crazy if you think about it. So in the course of this presentation, okay, I won't try and do the math, but it's happening every slide. There should be about 2 or 3 of them happening. But essentially, it's happening every 28 seconds. And the damage relating to cybercrime is projected to hit about $6 trillion annually for this year alone. So, I mean, those are massive, staggering, ramifications on businesses and the economy as a whole. Phishing attempts have increased by more than 660% since March of last year. I mean, timed very nicely with everybody's lockdowns because of, COVID-19 and the like. But because everybody moved online, people were working from home, these attacks just increased astronomically. And ransomware attacks themselves also rose about 148%. So, I mean, these stats are staggering. South Africa is known to have the 3rd highest number of cybercrime victims worldwide, and it results in about 2.2 billion rand loss each year. So while we rated as the 31st worst country when it comes to cybersecurity, I mean, we're known for a lot of things in South Africa, but apparently we're also known as being a country with lots of victims to cybercrime. And there's also now the rise of crime as a service, and that's what cyber criminals are able to offer. So you can go into the dark net and hire a criminal. I think that's really fascinating. So if you look at this slide here, it's a really fun website. It's called FireEye. And if you navigate here, you can actually see in real time the cyber threat landscape. And the arrows that are going in green from country to country, they show you where the attack is originating and which country is being attacked by a cybercrime. So this was taken a few days ago in the middle of the night, and you can see on the screen that there were some attacks that originating from Colombia, going into Algeria and Thailand. I think it's just really fascinating to see. So where are we when it comes to the Cybercrimes Bill? I mean, as you can see, it's a 2017 piece of law. But very interestingly, this bill actually came a couple of years before that. And when it was first published in its original form, it was called the Cybercrimes and Cybersecurity Bill. But what's happened since then is, the legislators realized, because of the public comment that they were receiving on that initial draft, that the cybersecurity elements of trying to regulate and legislate for that is just undoable. And they were creating lots of practical issues that was just not going to be very feasible for any organization. So they dropped the cybersecurity aspect of the Cybercrimes Bill. And so now we just have the Cybercrimes Bill. Just to point out, if you're looking for the right version, please go to, please look for the version called B6D. 2017, or email us and we will share with you a copy if you're interested. That is the version that is currently in play. It was introduced into Parliament in 2017, and last year on the 1st of July, the National Council of Provinces passed the bill. Interestingly, that date coincided with the first date of the grace period for which, POPI, or the Protection of Personal Information Act, came into force as well. So we're hoping I don't think you can think about cybercrimes without thinking about data and without thinking about personal information. So there's definitely some movement in government to try and move these pieces of law into play. So because they all will work together holistically. So what we are waiting for right now is for the president to actually sign this bill into law. So despite what you may have heard, the Cybercrimes Bill is not yet law, but it is likely that it will be very soon. But your guess is as good as mine as to when that may be. So getting into the crux of it, we are now going to walk you through an overview of the Cybercrimes Bill. So I think just to get an understanding of how, what is in the bill, so the chapters that are relating to the Cybercrimes Bill as a whole. So we have 9 chapters. It's significantly streamlined from where we had started, and they deal with very different elements. The first chapter sets out ordinarily, as you would find, the definitions that are applicable to the bill. We go into chapter 2 where we talk about the specific cybercrimes, and this is what everybody wants to know. What is a cybercrime? What is going to be an offense under this law? All the blocks that you see on the screen that are in black are the ones that we'll go into a little bit more detail on. So I'm going to skim over those. We have the jurisdiction section. We have a section dealing with the powers to investigate, search, and access or seize. So that chapter speaks to the powers of investigators. And an investigator in terms of the bill is a member of the South African Police Services that is actually empowered to action any of these things. So they are able to, obtain a warrant in order to determine if there is a cybercrime. The warrants can be obtained written or in oral form, and there's a procedure set out in the bill to deal with that. They're also able to conduct searches with a warrant and without a warrant, and the bill goes into detail about how they may be able to do that. They have the power to, or they can, with a warrant, arrest people who they suspect to be causing offenses. And there's also sections in that chapter dealing with the preservation of data and evidence, because that is the crux of trying to actually prove a cybercrime, as you would need to in a court. So there's some rules around that, which is really needed. Chapter 5 deals with mutual assistance. And in here, it actually provides for the ability of our government to interact with foreign states and to have their assistance in dealing with cybercrimes. As you know, the cybercriminals can be anywhere in the world. And so we do actually need the cooperation of other states to assist us in dealing and investigating these cybercrimes. Chapter 6 goes into the designated point of contact, and I'll speak to that in a few slides over. There's a chapter 7 deals with evidence. So predominantly, it's a very procedural aspect of the law. It speaks to how evidence may be gathered in the form of an affidavit, and that it is competent to be produced in a court of law when you are trying to try a cyber offense. Chapter 8 speaks to the reporting obligations, and we'll speak to that also in a few slides over. And the last chapter are just some general provisions. They talk to the agreements that can be concluded between South Africa and other countries for cooperation in dealing with the investigation and, trying of cybercrimes. And it also gives the legislators the ability to publish regulations in terms of the Cybercrimes Bill. So what is the purpose of this bill here? And why is it so important that we have one? So although people will tell you we don't have any cybercrime law, that would actually be incorrect. The Electronic Communications and Transactions Act has a very, very small section dealing with cybercrimes. And if you have a read, you'll see that it's about this big. Really, it is one paragraph about what is a cybercrime. And that's been now expanded upon greatly in this bill. So this bill takes us to a step further. It brings us in line with what is currently happening in the world. It allows for the creation and codification of cybercrime offenses. It brings about support structures that we need in order to conduct our investigations, to support our police services in trying to enforce some of the offenses and the penalties and the powers that they have in terms of this. law, and it goes through a various number of other related aspects. So it is definitely a very much needed law, and this one is one of those pieces of law in true fashion where, you know, the legislators are trying to play catch up to what is actually happening. With that, I'll hand over to Jessica Steele, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the details of what actually constitutes a cybercrime.
Cool. Thanks, Raki. Hello, everybody. So as Raki mentioned, I'm going to be going through the specific cyber crimes. They're all set out in Chapter 2, but the ones that you see on your screen at the moment form Part 1, and these are what I call the cyber crimes proper. So as a starting point, the thing that we really need to understand, like any other crime, there are elements to it. And before anyone can be found guilty of one of these crimes, all of them require both unlawfulness and intention. So I'm not going to bore you with a law lecture, but in a nutshell, unlawfulness refers to an unjustified action. So I always thought it was inappropriately named. So if you are able to have a proper justification for your action, then it wouldn't be unlawful. For example, if we use a common law example, murder, sorry, it's the first one that popped to my mind, but that's the unlawful intentional killing of somebody. So if you had a ground of justification, for example, self-defense, that would negate the unlawfulness. Okay, and then similarly, we have the requirement of intention. And intention is understanding the unlawfulness of your action, understanding the consequences, or at least reasonably foreseeing the consequences of your actions, and following through with it nonetheless. So if you followed the Oscar Pistorius case, I'm sure you know all about intention. You probably know more than I do. So that's our starting point. Okay, so if we start with Section 2, this refers to unlawful access. And unlawful access is really the intentional access to data or a computer program or a computer data storage medium or a computer system. In short, this is this is commonly referred to as hacking. So when I was speaking earlier about unlawfulness, if you were a white hat hacker, so someone who hacks systems on purpose in order to test the security of the system, for instance, that would be a justification. So you wouldn't be found guilty under the Section 2 for unlawful access because there was a clear ground or a reason for your actions. Then we have Section 3, which refers to the unlawful interception of data. And this includes the acquisition, viewing, capturing, or copying of data, which is non-public in nature. So as the word suggests, you're intercepting data. And an example of this would be a man-in-the-middle attack. So there are two people communicating, exchanging data, and someone pops up in the middle and either steals the data or views the data or might even manipulate the data and impersonate either the sender or the receiver. So this type of crime really compromises the confidentiality of data through, for example, eavesdropping or the integrity of the data by impersonating either the sender or the receiver. Okay, and then we have Section 4, which are unlawful acts in respect of software and hardware tools. So either you are using software to commit one of these offenses, or you possess software that enables the commission of one of these offenses. So on the screen, you can see there's an example there of TOPS, which is basically a type of software which is ransomware as a service. So you might have heard of software as a service, for example. So this is a similar application, except it's allowing you to commit a ransomware attack. And the really scary thing about this is that any person can download it and any person can commit a ransomware attack quite easily. You don't need any specialist skills. So we often think that cyber criminals are these savants, these mathematical computer geniuses, but they're not. They're everyday people And to just explain how simple it is, I didn't download the software myself, but I watched a video. And really, there are these little input fields, and you input the destination of your ransomware attack. And then there's a drop-down menu where you choose the date and how long you want your attack to last. And then another field where you say, I want X amount of crypto, Bitcoin, for example, in order to release your files. So that just shows just how easy it is. And that's the basic version. The pro version, which you would pay a little bit more for, apparently makes it even easier. I'm not sure how much easier it can get. So basically, if you were to have the software on your computer, you would also be guilty of an offense. Section 5 and Section 6 both speak to unlawful interference. So the one is about unlawful interference with respect to data or a computer program. And this refers to the deletion of data or altering of data, otherwise rendering data vulnerable. So again, this talks to the confidentiality and integrity of data. And then Section 6 is slightly more nuanced, where you're interfering with the computer storage system itself. So there, you're either exposing data or you're making the system difficult to access, so like a denial of service attack, for example. And I think ransomware would also fit into that category. Then we have Section 7, which is a little bit more interesting. So that's all about accessing or acquiring someone's passcode. And the section actually defines what a passcode is. And it can be a normal PIN, like we understand our banking PIN, or a string of characters and letters, your password to access your computer, for example. But it can also be an image, a security token, an access card, or biometric data. So if you think of all those James Bond spy movies where we steal the image of someone's retina, or we take imprints of their fingerprints, and if you use that, let's say, to try and access a system that you're not authorized to access, then you would also be contravening Section 7. Okay, and then we move on to what we call cyber fraud. So cyber fraud is similar to the common law offense of fraud. So fraud is the unlawful making with the intent to defraud a misrepresentation which causes actual prejudice or which could potentially prejudice another person. So fraud and forgery and uttering, which I'm getting to now, is different to extortion in Section 10, where the fraud and the uttering really only require a potential prejudice to somebody. It can be actual, but also potential. So there's a lower threshold that you need to sort of follow through. So cyber fraud would be using a data or computer program or interfering with data in some way in order to defraud somebody. So phishing, for example, Raki went through it just now. Phishing would be an example of cyber fraud. We're using deceptive emails or websites or text messages to steal your confidential information or your personal information, and then to do something illegal with that. And then cyber forgery and uttering is, so forgery is the creation of false data or a false computer program with the intention to defraud somebody. And cyber uttering is passing off of false data or a false computer program with the intention of it to defraud somebody. So you might see the headline on the screen, the Durban Facebook bully who tried to extort neighbor pleads guilty. And I think this case kind of falls in between the fraud and the forgery, and but not quite extortion. I'll explain why. So this man, he found his next door neighbor on Facebook and clearly did not like his next door neighbor. And he created a fake Facebook profile and also used prepaid cell phones belonging to, I think, his father. And And he started harassing his neighbor by sending him very threatening messages on Facebook and later text messages, threatening to murder him or to murder the man that was the security guard at his property, and doing all sorts of terrible things, and describing his movements. And at one point, he kept sending Ubers to his house. So this man was obviously really freaked out because someone really knows his comings and goings. And unfortunately, the story doesn't say how they eventually figured out that it was actually his own next door neighbor. But this man had said, you know, if you don't put 52,000 Rand in your post box, then I'm going to come and do all these terrible things to you. So that's obviously a very clear example of cyber forgery and extortion. And uttering, excuse me. Extortion. So I mentioned that extortion is a little bit different. And extortion is really a crime involving the attack or the threat of an attack against an enterprise. But in particular, in Section 10, it requires you to make a threat to either hack the system or, so for instance, if I threatened a company and said, if you don't do X, then I will shut down your entire computer network, for instance. So that would be a form of cyber extortion. So you're demanding money or maybe some other action to prevent a threatened attack. Okay, and then Section 11 speaks about aggravated offences. And there are really two categories of these. So the first category refers to what the Act or the bill talks about, a restricted computer system. And a restricted computer system is any data, computer program, or computer storage medium which is under the control or exclusively used by a financial institution or an organ of state, and which is protected by security measures to prevent unauthorized access. So if you were to commit a Section 3 offense, so unlawfully intercepting data, or unlawful interference with data, or unlawfully interfering with that computer system itself, you would be committing an aggravated offense. And that obviously is coupled with a more severe punishment. And that makes sense because our financial institutions are obviously very important, and so are our organs of state. The second category of aggravated offense is one where, so it's either a Section 5, 6, or 10 offense. So that's the unlawful interference with data, or the computer storage system, or cyber extortion, where the result of that is to either endanger someone's life or to cause severe bodily injury, or to cause serious risk to the health and safety of the public, or otherwise to create a public emergency situation. So, for example, I think there was a movie at one stage where this hacker was able to switch off all of the robots, and that would create absolute mayhem, as you can imagine. Just come to South Africa when we're load shedding. And so that would also be an aggravated offense. Okay, and then the last one, Section 12, is the theft of incorporeal property. So this section says that the common law offense of theft must be interpreted so as not to exclude the theft of incorporeal property. On the face of this, it might seem a little bit silly because theft is theft, but actually under the common law, when you look at what theft means, one of the elements is obviously the taking of property. And the way it was always interpreted was that it needs to be something capable of being stolen. So obviously in our law, you can't steal immovable property because it can't be taken. And unfortunately, this trend was pulled through from the Roman Dutch law all the way into our law. And it started in 1948 with this case referred to as Cheeseborough, where someone said, well, you can only steal something corporeal, physical, so you can't steal ideas or something that you can't physically hold. And that led to further interpretations that you can't steal software. You might have an infringement claim or something, but it's not a crime. And as we moved along, eventually our appellate division did say that stealing money through online banking systems, because that is really actually, there's no physical exchange of anything there. That's just 2 entries in ledgers. But eventually the appellate division said, okay, no, that would be stealing. So we were able to stretch it a little bit, but this section 12 has now at least taken away any doubt that it is a crime to steal software or really incorporeal property of any kind, a patent or etc. So that's really important. So those, in a very quick nutshell, were our cyber crimes in part 1. Okay. Then we have in part 2 it gets its whole own section, malicious communications. And as with the other cyber crimes, we need unlawfulness and we need intention, but here we also need disclosure. So disclosure is quite broadly defined in the bill, and it means to either to send the message in some form. So it's not just disclosing it to a third party who wasn't a part of the communication, it's also sending it to your intended recipient, and that'll make sense when we go through section 14 and 15. So section 14 is to send a data message which incites damage to property or violence. So for instance, when we went through the protests at our universities, there were quite a number of WhatsApp groups where members would organize their protests, and unfortunately, some of those organizations ended up erupting into illegal activities. So in these instances, this sort of section may be triggered where you are inciting damage to property or violence, for instance. And then section 15, similarly, you're threatening another person with damage to property or violence, or you could also be threatening a group of people. So this is really all about not using electronic communication services to otherwise assault people just online. And then section 16 is our revenge porn provision. So this is the disclosure of an intimate image. An intimate image is obviously an image that where someone maybe is exposed in some way or another. And the important part about this is that it's without consent, and the person must have necessarily assumed that the situation that they were sending this message in was private and their privacy would be respected. So, for example, I'm sure many of you can recall this poor woman who sent her husband a naughty picture and accidentally sent it on her child, I think it was his hockey group or her hockey group. And everyone jumped on this and started forwarding this image. And I mean, we can all fob it off. It was a really silly thing to do. We're all told to not take naked pictures of ourselves, but this was a husband and wife situation. So under this instance, I think anyone on the group would reasonably have assumed that this message was sent accidentally, that the sender of the message or the taker of the photo had an expectation that her privacy was going to be protected. She thought she was sending it to her husband, and they all sent it without asking. So there was no consent to the image being shared. So this is one form of where you'd be in contravention of section 16. The other form of it is the revenge porn, where I'm not going to go into a long explanation, but a couple who were previously together perhaps shared images, and then they break up and one of them is disgruntled and they decide to share these images online in a way to sort of get back at the other person. So those are malicious communications. Okay, so the penalties, these are all crimes. So you are convicted, either sentenced to prison or a fine or both. And you can be sentenced for anything from 1 to 15 years, as well as a fine. So the Durban guy, the Facebook guy, he was actually charged under our normal common law crimes, and he ended up having a sentence of 2 years, but that was deferred and only had to pay a 62,000 rand fine. So my hope would be with this legislation that perhaps people would be more severely punished because in the sentencing provision, it actually asks the court to take into account that this sort of thing was done over data message, and that's almost seen as an aggravating factor. And then we have a protection order, which is more about focusing on the victim itself. And this is either you can approach, so the first part of our protection order is that you must lay a criminal charge. And once you have a criminal charge, then you can approach a magistrate's court and you can request the person who has sent or disclosed this message or accessed your systems to stop doing it or to stop further disclosing the images. And then there's another protection order that you can obtain, which is to order an electronic communication service provider whose electronic communication service is used to host or disclose the data to remove or disable the access to the image. And so those are quite important and I think very helpful rights, provided of course you've laid a complaint. The difficulty is that you won't always know who it is who's done it. For instance, think about the Facebook man, and you might not know which electronic communication service provider is the sender of the service that's being used to send the message. So in those instances, at least what you can do, you can still approach the court and then you try and obtain an order from an electronic communication service provider who you reasonably assume to be involved. To my mind, I would think that I would probably use my provider because that's how I received the message, and perhaps they would be able to backtrack and figure out who sent it. And the provisions could actually, the provisions in the bill actually say that a magistrate can then order an electronic communication service provider to provide further particulars, which means to provide the information, disclose the identity of the sender and his or her details if they have them. So those are quite helpful provisions, and I think if used properly could be very helpful. Okay, and then we have the obligations of electronic communication service providers and financial institutions. And really the obligation is to report. So if an ESP or financial institution becomes aware or is aware that a computer system is involved in the commission of any category or class of offense in Part 1, those were all the crimes that we went through just now, Section 2 to Section 12, then without any undue delay, but no longer than 72 hours later, they must report the offense to the South African Police Service, and they must ensure that they preserve any of the information that they have on hand. And the failure to do so can lead to a fine, which won't exceed 50,000 Rand. So, I mean, this might sound like a really small penalty, but if you consider this in the bigger framework of if this sort of thing happens and they fail to report, it probably means that they fail to report under POPI as well, and then you're facing other potential fines, and you're also facing some serious reputational risk. Okay. And then I hand over to Rafi. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. Just picking up some of the questions that's been coming through in the chat. Yes, we will be providing a copy of the presentation and the slides, so not to worry. I hope you haven't been trying to write frantically. And the next one was, I think there was just a question about the Durban case, the man that was convicted. He wasn't convicted under the Cybercrimes Bill because naturally it's not yet law. He was convicted under our other criminal laws that are in place. So that's just a quick answer on those two. The rest are a little bit more longer, so we hope we'll get back to you over email. But just to continue around the Cybercrimes Bill and two other sections which we think are quite important. The first of which is jurisdiction. So naturally, one of the biggest elements that any country has to sort of try and find a way to deal with is how are we going to allow our country to actually try these offenders who've committed these cybercrimes, because they may not be in South Africa. So what are we going to, how do we extend our court's jurisdiction to enable to try these offenses? So what the Cybercrimes Bill does, it says that all South African courts have jurisdiction in the following instances, and it sets out these categories. So the first few of which, and some of them have been combined just for the sake of being able to explain it easier. But if a person has been arrested or the offense itself is committed in South Africa on board a vessel, a ship, some kind of installation or fixed platform in the borders of South Africa, so in our seas, or on an aircraft that's been registered in South Africa, then our courts would have jurisdiction over that offense. If the person who's been, who's the offender in this in the case that may arise, is a citizen, a resident, or in terms of an entity, if they incorporated or registered in South Africa, then our courts would have jurisdiction. If any of the actions in preparation of the offense, or if any of the actions that was necessary to enable that person to commit the offense occurred in South Africa, then again, and again, this extends to any vessel, ship, installation, or fixed platform or aircraft, then the courts would have jurisdiction. So this is one of the few laws that we have that actually goes quite broader than the court's general sense of jurisdiction. And it's because of the nature of these crimes. Similarly, if the offense affects a person or a restricted computer system in a public body or a business in South Africa, then the court will have jurisdiction. And just to remind you, Jess mentioned it earlier, a restricted computer system in a public body would be that of a financial institution, but because of the specific, it could mean a financial institution or that in an organ of state, but here it's speaking specifically about, whether a public body or business. So if the offense related to a restricted computer system, then our courts would have jurisdiction. And lastly, if the offense was committed outside of South Africa, so this is in instances where the person is not in the boundaries and the borders of South Africa, but the victim is a citizen, a resident, an incorporated or registered entity in South Africa, or it relates to a restricted computer system or government facility in South Africa, then our courts would have jurisdiction. And there's also a nice little catch-all which just says if there's any other basis that the court might think that they have jurisdiction over that offense, then they would have the ability to consider that crime and try that offender in South Africa. So this really extends, the general common law principles and those that are legislated in terms of our court's jurisdiction to include these to cater for the unique nature of cybercrimes. Moving on to the last section in the bill, which we think is also very interesting, and I think this is what a lot of people also would like to know, is what do we do? So yes, there's these laws now that will hopefully codify these crimes, gives rise to the ability to, try these offenses. But as a victim, where do you go? So we know that you can go and get a protection order, as Jess just mentioned. But further to that, your initial starting point is that there's going to be this designated point of contact. So the National Commissioner must actually establish and designate an office within the existing structures of the police services. So within SAPS, all of them, or however they may decide, there needs to be this designated point of contact. In addition, the National Commissioner actually has to equip and maintain this point of contact. So it can't just be one of these, shelves that's going to just be in place. We actually need it to work. So the law went the bill goes into a bit of detail in explaining what that means. And the purpose of this designated point of contact is to provide immediate, expedited assistance for proceedings and investigations of crime, cybercrimes. So the world of cybercrime is very fast-paced. You can't be, the incident happened today and we'll follow up 2 weeks from now. That's just not going to work. We're not going to get anywhere. And knowing how the current system is, the bill foresees those problems and is actually allowed for this designated point of contact to be an expedited place in order to actually give effect to the remedies that are available to victims in terms of the bill. And the assistance that these designated point of contacts have to give is they need to provide technical advice and assistance. They need to allow and provide legal assistance. They must assist with identification and location of whatever is subject to the cybercrime. They must provide cooperation with appropriate authorities of a foreign state if it's relevant, and also help with the identification and location of the suspect, so the actual accuser. So as you can see, they've they've thought about it and they realize the nature of cybercrimes and the best way in order to help people. So we are, I mean, it's always, South Africa is a place that has amazing laws and we sometimes fall flat in its execution. So we're hoping that this would not be one of those instances, and we will actually have real remedies in order if we are a victim of cybercrime. I'm going to hand over to Ridwan.
Thank you, Rocky. Thanks very much, Rocky and Jessica. Just to conclude the section, next slide, please, Jessica. So the bill raises a number of interesting questions. As I mentioned at the outset today was intended just to be an overview and introduction to the bill. Obviously, it gets a lot more detail, a lot more involved, and there's a lot of considerations which companies would need to face. Also, when looking at the Cybercrimes Bill, it cannot be seen in isolation. You still need to consider other legislation such as POPI, other various codes of regulation, PAIA, for example. And as a company, part of your thinking around the Cybercrimes Bill is, number one, how do you insulate your own organization from actually being in breach of the Cybercrimes Bill once it becomes inadvertently? So you may have, for example, policies and procedures, or you may, for example, have your IT security team perpetrate denial of service attacks on malicious websites out there, which may be detrimental to your business. So there's a lot of consideration that needs to be given. First of all, how do I, as an organization, protect my organization from actually being a perpetrator of cybercrimes? Because the bill is well intended, it's actually intended to help, the good, the innocent, those affected. But inadvertently, even innocent organizations, in their haste to, or in the efforts to protect themselves, may actually find that they actually become perpetrators of cybercrimes in their own right. So there's a lot of thinking and consideration behind it. Also, other questions which arise: how effectively will the state actually be able to respond to crimes reported? As Raki mentioned, the National Commission of Police is expected to set up a structure within the current SAPS structures in order to assist with policing the bill. Now, if it's going to be left to your local station commander and who's under-resourced to begin with to actually assist in policing the bill and assisting companies, we all know how that's going to turn out. And if we don't have strong law enforcement, I mean, the bill really becomes, or would be significantly weakened, because without enforcement, the best intended law is really not going to get anywhere. Also then, as part of your thinking as an organization is, once promulgated, how will the bill actually affect your employees and employee behavior? So for example, in many industries, you have employees who may move from one organization to another and take marketing lists or take data from an organization. Would that act actually amount to a cybercrime? Do you actually have now additional enforcement remedies as an employer who may be disgruntled that an employee is taking your trade secrets and the like? So it raises a lot of interesting questions. Next slide, please, Jess. Over the months to come, I'm sure every company will need to start thinking through exactly what your current processes are like. And the best time to do it, if you haven't already, commence your POPI compliance programs, which we do encourage you to start now, and don't wait, because it is a journey. But as part of assessing your overall POPI compliance, it's a good time to also assess your cybersecurity readiness, but also if some of your cybersecurity activities actually in themselves amount to cybercrimes. And it's critical to ensure that all of your policies factor in all applicable legislation, not just POPI, not just the regulatory code. So for example, if you are a banking institution, not just the Cybercrimes Bill in isolation, but also factoring out there what's common sense, what's best practice in your industry, and the like, and ensure that your policies are relooked at and crafted and they're fit for purpose. Also, it's critical, as it's a constant message which we give to all of our clients, POPI compliance, for example, is incomplete without cybersecurity training. And a big part of your cybersecurity training is now training your staff as to what types of behavior could inadvertently lead your company to being a perpetrator of a cybercrime itself. So it's not just what your rights and remedies are if you are affected party, but also if you are doing certain things, if your teams are doing certain things, if some of the cybersecurity initiatives which you've put in are structured in such a way that it could be construed as you committing a cybercrime. These are things which you would need to look at and need to consider as part of your practical application of the cybercrimes. Then, because the Cybercrimes Bill, as with POPI, as with various directives by regulators such as the SAP, because it places a proactive reporting duty on organizations, it's essential that when you are faced with a cybercrime, number one, you need to have a very structured incident response plan, which triggers the right people into action, not just your legal teams, not just your cybersecurity experts, but PR agencies, for example. You may need to bring in external cybersecurity experts, but also external legal counsel, because what you want to do is couch your entire breach and everything around it and everything around your incident response plan in some form of legal privilege. And then finally, just I hate to say it, but a quick sales pitch from ENS side. Where we do assist clients significantly at the moment, contracting for cybersecurity services. So more and more companies are embracing third-party cybersecurity service providers. But if you're not going to put in place proper contracts, again, the best cybersecurity service is going to fall by the wayside, because if you don't have recourse against those who are intended to protect you, what assurance do you have? Are you going to have that you're actually going to be protected or insulated from those really malicious people out there, not just hackers, but also potentially your employees, disgruntled employees and the like. Also, drafting and vetting of policies and procedures. This is critical. And as I mentioned, a big part of your compliance journey, not just with POPI, but also with other cybersecurity or with the Cybercrimes Act and other corresponding legislation and regulation, is that you do have policies and procedures in place. Cybersecurity training is essential. POPI training likewise is essential, and the two should not be seen in isolation from each other, because you don't want to have on the one hand cybersecurity training and on the other hand POPI training, and the two are totally conflicting with each other. There are overlaps between the two, but the two are not mutually exclusive. Also, where we can assist organizations, ENS does render a breach response service. So if you are faced with a cyber breach, we can assist you with that. The information regulator under POPI has encouraged organizations in the lead up to 1 July to actually engage in voluntary reporting of breaches. Also, once the act comes into law, and you need to, and implicitly in POPI already, there's an implicit requirement that you already notify the police services. So you would need assistance in handholding during that process, especially if your organization is not experienced or has not undergone a breach previously. Also, ENS has a big forensics team and an investigations team, which we can assist with. And then obviously liaising with regulatory bodies, any litigation, court orders, etc. We can also assist you with. So in summary for today's discussion, today was meant to be a very high level overview of the Cybercrimes Bill. We do understand it raises a lot of additional questions, but your next steps as a company is to start obviously unpacking the bill in more detail, and then ascertaining how is the bill going to affect me. First of all, affect me as a potential victim of cybercrime. Do I have policies in place to report these cybercrimes as and when they occur? Do I have the right type of service providers, cybersecurity providers, etc., who will be able to assist me when or if I am a victim of cybercrimes? But also on the flip side of it, am I engaging in any sort of process or any sort of activity that could actually amount to me being a perpetrator of a cybercrime without me inadvertently knowing about it? So we do thank you very much for attending today's sessions. We do see that there are a lot of questions. We will endeavor to respond to each of you individually by email based on your questions. As Raki mentioned, we will circulate a copy of the slides, and we will circulate a copy of the latest version of the bill as well. So please do get in touch with myself or any member of my team. Our details will follow as well. So thank you very much for attending today's session, and look forward to seeing you or speaking to you again at our next session. Thank you all.